I could actually say welcome to the new decade, right? And we are starting this with an amazing lecture. Happy New Year, everyone. Glad to have you here. This lecture series is always fantastic, not only because we get to invite great architects or other professionals, but we also get to invite friends. And it's a great moment to discuss where architecture is, where it would go, where everyone is working on. So I think for me, it's a huge privilege to be able to invite tonight's lecture by Eric Howler. Eric and I met actually Eric a long time ago, but got to know him mostly when I was teaching. I escaped Penn for a little bit and went to teach in Harvard. And it was really great to get to know you, to get to know everyone at Harvard, and to kind of enter a whole other discussion. And it always stayed with me how important that is, right? Like to share these kind of ideas. So Eric is an associate professor at Harvard GSD and a co-founder of Höweler and Yoon Architecture. That brings me to Meijin, who we had invited and really wanted to be here, but Meijin is also the dean in Cornell and the provost, I think, threw a fit, and decided that all the deans immediately had to meet with the provost. Nothing bad, just instant. So she sent her apologies, and we're super grateful that you, Eric, are still with us and are giving this lecture tonight. So Eric has taught advanced design studios and lectures on topics in building systems at Harvard since 2008. He was recently appointed the area head for the Masters of Design Studies in Energy and Environmental programs, where he advises students on topics around energy modeling and simulations, as well as environmental control systems. For the last 18 years, his Boston-based firm Höweler and Yoon has been recognized as a research-driven multidisciplinary design studio, working between architecture and research, art, and media. Their work is technologically and formally innovative, you will see that, and deeply informed by human experience and the sensitivity to tectonics. One of the firm's celebrated projects is the MIT Collier Memorial, an amazing structure. Are you showing that? Love that. A milled granite compression structure that commemorates the life of Officer Sean Collier, who was killed in action after the Boston Marathon bombing. The Collier Memorial has been honored with the BSA Honor Award, the American Architecture Prize, the AA Religious Architecture Award, and has 3 times been a finalist for the Harleston Parker Medal. So that's a lot of things on this, but you'll see why. It is absolutely stunning. Current projects include the Uva Memorial, the landscape installation dedicated to an enslaved laborers at the University of Virginia. Students may recall last fall's lecture, actually, on the same subject with Mabel Wilson of Columbia, another member of the UVA Memorial design team. Here in Philadelphia, Howler and Yoon are creating the public art installation and a floating laboratory on the Schuylkill River. Howler and Yoon's work has been exhibited at the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, and has been published and reviewed in many international architecture publications, as well as in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Financial Times. I'm saying that because we architects like to be in non-architectural publications. It means that actually other people also are interested in architecture, we hope, right? I think so. But not only that, Eric has also authored several books, including The Expanded Practice with Meijin, published by Princeton Architectural Press in 2009, Skyscraper Vertical Now, published by Rizzoli in 2003, and many others you can find. But I thought it's really great that as an architect, the only way we get sometimes to communicate our ideas is not only through lectures, but through writing. Höweler and Yoon Architecture has received numerous awards, including the Progressive Architecture Award, the Audi Urban Futures Award, that's a fun one, the Design Vanguard Award by Architectural Record, the Emerging Voices Award by the Architecture League, as well as several national and local AIA awards. Born in Cali, Colombia, Eric is actually Dutch-Chinese. I never knew he was Dutch, which is kind of funny. So he's, you know, he got a whole new value there, of course, in my eyes. You know why. But he also studied here in the US. So he did his bachelor's and master's at Cornell. And before starting his own practice, he has worked in the offices of Diller and Scafidio for many years, and in KPF, where he was an architect working. But that brings me to KPF, which is kind of actually a funny coincidence. Don't forget to come next Monday to Jean Cohn's lecture. And, you know, maybe I'll ask Jean to show some of the projects you've worked on. That could be a nice feedback loop right there. So it's interesting how these things join over and cross-pollinate. Super happy to have you here, Eric. And please help me welcome Eric to the stage.
Thank you, Lincoln. Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. I'm happy to be here. I was saying I'd been here before, but never in an official capacity, so I sort of stopped through the studios once last semester at some point. But I'm happy to be here. The title of this talk is called Forms of Engagement. It's a title that Meijin came up with, so I'm not sure exactly what she meant, but I'm going to give it a shot. So I think she was talking about how do we work as architects and how do we sort of execute things in the world. Some of the things that we admire, not just architecture, we look at Sol LeWitt and the way he sort of conceptualizes a piece by saying, I'm going to come up with a set of rules and instructions, and then it can be executed by different people at different times in different contexts, and that's how it gains a kind of meaning. But this idea of rule-based is something that we think about a lot as designers, constraints, rules, and if we think about, you know, how do we think about architecture in the present moment, how do we think about the digital, we might describe it as rule-based. So what are the kind of rules for architecture? Another project that we like to show a lot is Vito Canci's Following piece, which is a project which is also based on rules. Vito Canci is the guy in the black leather jacket, and he decided to chart the kind of limits of the public realm by finding someone in New York and following them. It sounds kind of creepy, but he would follow them until they went from a public space into a private space. So he would follow them on the bus, he would follow them in the streets, and by doing this sort of very personal, very kind of one-on-one project of following, he actually sort of created a kind of map of the limits of the public realm. This is a project from the 1970s, but we like it because it combines many of our interests. One, kind of rule-based thinking, and two, this question of what is public and how does the public realm sort of figure in our kind of architectural thinking. We like to think of rules of engagement as sometimes being explicit, like you may do this, you may not do this, and we sort of find examples of that everywhere. We also think that there's rules that are unspoken, that are social rules or social codes that might not be spelled out somewhere, but are kind of understood. So what happens in the public realm that doesn't happen in your apartment, whether it's attention, wanted or unwanted, these are subtle kind of human behavior questions that I think are sort of lurking in kind of urban spaces in architectural projects. And how does the kind of individual work in the public realm, and how does a collective sort of form? And we like to think about building buildings, but also kind of building behaviors and how we might sort of imagine people using spaces like this one in creative ways, in a way forming a kind of public as we sort of form a kind of architectural, spatial or material idea. The other thing that's happened is that the public realm is saturated not just with material and people, but with images and technology. And so we like to think about how does technology affect our interactions with each other, our interactions with the city, and what happens when technology sort of starts to sort of occupy your personal space. So we're not talking about a kind of unequipped public. We're talking about a public that is completely connected and networked and carrying, in a way, technology in their pockets. And so those are kind of questions that sort of structure some of our first thinking about architecture. So we can think about personal space, and a project that I like to show is a project Mijin did in 2001. It's called the Defensible Dress. It's a project she did for the Media Lab when she was a professor at MIT. She took a class at MIT, which is one of those interesting things where you're faculty but you take classes. So she designed a dress that was defensible, that was sort of delimiting a kind of private space. And she said, could we think about a kind of social question, a kind of unspoken code through technology? And so this used a kind of passive infrared sensor, a microcontroller, nitinol wire, which is a shape memory alloy. And it basically produced a kind of wearable that was, I would say, 100% architectural. People said, is it fashion? And we said, no, it's architecture. It's spatial, it's personal space, and it's technology. So in 2001, this project kind of launched a practice. It launched a kind of set of questions that I think we're still kind of working out today. Coming right off of that, we made a proposal for the Athens Olympics, which is called White Noise, White Light. It was a competition in 2004 to create a kind of immersive field at the base of the Acropolis during the Olympics. And this used the same technology, infrared sensors. And the idea was you walk through the field is activated. It sort of creates a trace or a wake of white noise and white light. And in 2004, this was kind of a radical idea that we could sort of define space, not with form or material, but actually with effects. And being at MIT, we sort of said, let's do this. And we collaborated with electronics engineers and computer programmers, with fabricators, and we executed this project in Athens for the Olympics in 2004. And these are some of the components, basically microcontrollers, speakers, wires, fiber optics. Looking at the way people interacted in this space, it taught us a little bit about what you think people will do and what people actually do. And people didn't behave the way we expected, kind of wandering through and sort of leaving this trail. They kind of stood in one place and tried to like figure out how it worked, you know. And so we started realizing that we have to design behaviors and we have to think about misbehavior in addition to behavior. Engagement, people were certainly engaged with this piece, and they started to engage with each other in the piece. And we thought, this is interesting. How do we bring people together around space, around effects? And at this point, we started thinking about how can we think about media or information as a material, as a kind of raw material for a project. At some point, Arcus magazine published a spreadsheet. They said this has neither material nor concept, and that was kind of brutal. But we thought it doesn't have material, but it certainly has media, and it certainly has effect. So we thought in a way that's kind of important. And we've kept doing projects that sort of incorporate these questions of behavior, sometimes questions of material. A few years ago, we did these swings in Boston as a temporary public art project. We thought, wouldn't it be cool if people would interact, not just as children, but like could grown-ups play? And how do we think about playfulness in the public realm? These swings have microcontrollers, so as they swing, they turn from blue to pink. There's a kind of accelerometer in them. And this sort of induces a kind of behavior. It induces people to swing as if they need to be induced to swing. But people would not get out of these things. They would sort of stay in them. And they were hugely popular. So a temporary public art piece became a kind of fixture within the kind of landscape in Boston. Now it's one of those places where people go when they visit Boston. It's become a kind of landmark in the city, a kind of temporary public art project. So another kind of lesson in terms of fabrication, you know, milling polypropylene, welding polypropylene, programming a basic microcontroller. These are things that we can do in our shop. We like to do a few kind of hands-on prototyping projects ourselves. Over the years, we've sort of evolved this thing from polypropylene to different kinds of fabrication, including rotomolding, kind of casting or molding like this with low-density polyethylene to create a kind of singular, whoops, that looks distorted. Anyways, that's showing the kind of tilt switch in there. But it's a super successful project. The convention center, it draws lots of people, and they don't want to take it down. So it's become from a temporary project to a kind of a more permanent project. But on a weekend in the summer, it's hard to get a swing. And we sort of keep track of how people use them, or abuse them, or misuse them. the convention center said, can you create some rules? And we said, well, we can say do this, but don't do this. They said it'd be nice if there were more do's than don'ts, because they didn't want to be all about don't. So we made some of these, and then we sort of, we sort of keep track of this project on social media. So how do people use the project? Inventing new ways to use it. She's like, I didn't break the rules, so she knows their rules. Lots of kind of behavioral questions. Even Delta Airlines, was saying, go, what did it say? The world is your playground. So in a way, this sort of confers a kind of landmark status to this project. As a separate project, we started to sort of riff on this question of do's and don'ts. And so, we said, why don't we encourage different kinds of behavior, forms of engagement. Don't do this, no smoking, and no rough play. Enjoy responsibly. These are things you've heard, right? So don't leave your luggage unattended. Don't take our swings. Selfies welcome. Games, music. I don't know what that is. But we sort of got carried away. Keep track of your pets. Urban farming is good. So it just became like, what do we like? What do we support? What do we want to give value to? And it sort of exceeded the swing, right? It was no longer about the swing. It became about like what's good behavior? What should we support? What should we not support? Maybe don't do that. Anyways, we got carried away, but we did enjoy the fact that this project, this such a simple project, had this kind of extensive sort of afterlife and produced effects that we couldn't have calculated, couldn't have built in. So the kind of surprising sort of consequences of a provocative piece of art in the public realm. This takes me to this question of like engagement and how do we think about engagement, not just with architecture, but with media. And we're constantly thinking about like architecture as a form of media. Does it have a kind of broadcast function? Should we think about architecture as a kind of broadcast media that can compete with the technologies in our pockets, right? And how does the technology in our pocket sort of mask out all the kind of world around us? So we're all sort of competing with this effect. And if we live in the age of information, which I think we arguably could say we do, how come we're also in the age of post-truth? We don't know what's been written. We have less grasp on truth or some sort of objective truth than we did maybe 15, 20 years ago. So that's a kind of paradox that we sort of find in our daily lives. You turn on the TV, we can't believe what's happening. And so how does architecture sort of work against that backdrop of this kind of information overload, in this kind of sort of waterfall, the deluge of content? That's something that we talked about in a kind of writing about what we call signal to noise, like what's the combination of signal and noise that architecture can participate in. And you could say architecture is a kind of broadcast medium. It has a kind of broadcast function at a certain scale. It's reaching a kind of mass audience, whether it's by signage or by color or through display. Buildings have become kind of display surfaces. And is that an opportunity for architecture to sort of participate in this kind of larger kind of media landscape? So the first part of our practice was thinking about media as material, as kind of raw material for design. And we did a number of projects that tried to bring technology into the physical world. Interactivity, broadcasting, through different projects, broadcasting environmental effects, like a windscreen project here. And recently, we've been thinking about the other side of that. So instead of media as material, how do we think about material after media? And you could argue that everything is after media now, but how can we be thoughtful about that? Not just sort of doing business as usual architecture, but thinking about material, how we materialize through media, through information, through the kind of digital tools that we use these days without giving it too much thought, right? We kind of incorporated it, we've ingested technology. It's part of our process. We just, it's part of our daily lives. How can we be thoughtful about the tools that we're working with on a daily basis? So material after media. And this is the project that Winka mentioned, this question of the marathon bombing. a police officer killed. And it sort of raised the question for us is like, how do we think about memory in the age of the kind of information superabundance? Like, what's the status of memory, and how can you make a memorial in this day and age? And I walked by, the Massachusetts DOT had turned a sign into a kind of memorial. So that's kind of, there's potential there. When we thought about MIT and Sean Collier, we thought about the university. What's its slogan? Mens et manus, hand and mind. This is something that MIT was also kind of grappling with. There was all this talk about fortis, strength, MIT strong, Boston strong. And that was a kind of, I think, a response to this incredible sort of tragedy. This is Frank Gehry's Status Center. This is Main Street, and Sean Collier was killed here, and so this became the site for this memorial. As we thought about it, we said, how can we give form to something that's meant to sort of memorialize an individual? And the family said, wouldn't it be nice if there was a kind of boulder, because Sean was a kind of outdoorsman. The police officer said, it'd be nice if there was a star, like a flag or something. And people said, well, wouldn't it be nice if there was a forest and a water feature? So we were getting all these kind of different kind of, not demands, but requests. And we said, well, the most important thing is to convey a sense of absence, right? That he's not there anymore. So how do we sort of take a figure and remove it from another figure? So this was an idea that happened. We did a quick sketch, and then we sort of brought it into a model, and we said, why don't we sort of Boolean one figure from another? And when you go there, you'll sort of appreciate the kind of missing figure of this boulder that the family had requested. So we didn't give them what they wanted, but we gave them a kind of trace or a kind of pantomime of that figure. The other idea was, can we make it out of solid stone? And this is something that came pretty early. We said, it looks like an arch. Maybe we can make it out of, just solid compression. So we worked with John Oxendorf, who's here, Hauke Jungehan from Nippers Helbig in Stuttgart. This is Sam Morelli from Suffolk Construction. And here we're trying to figure out, how do we build an arch? An arch, like the most basic sort of elemental sort of structural scheme that we sort of forgot how to do. We don't have the technology, we don't have the technique anymore. We haven't done one in so long. So we proposed this to MIT. We said this idea of the arch will sort of bring people together. Every piece will be important to sort of produce span. And that idea of a kind of collective, all these parts that are different coming together to produce the span was something that MIT really bought into. We worked on the kind of deflections with our engineers, all the different load cases, and discovered that we needed a kind of precision fit, that every stone had to fit with the adjacent stones. We couldn't have any horizontal displacement because the arch was so shallow that if it moved an inch this way or an inch that way, it would move 6 inches this way. So the kind of necessity of fit required a fabrication process that wouldn't allow for any error. So working with the kind of thrust diagrams, we developed some software with John Oxendorf and his building technology group to calculate this basic physics of the weight of the stone, its sort of vertical vector, and if we're sort of moving that into a kind of oblique vector, that produces a thrust line that has to remain within the buttress. And so those were some of the parameters. We developed a number of versions of it and some tools to study it. We had 4 different engineers, structural engineers on the project. They didn't agree on it. And so we would sort of sit in a meeting with all these different engineers sort of arguing about, well, the digital model said this. Well, the calculation said that. And so going back and forth between, do we need any tension in this system at all? And most software that we use has both tension and compression. And John Oxendorf argued that if you have a system that's designed for tension and compression, but you're doing only compression, you're not going to get the results from a model that's based on both of these. So very interesting debates. At the end of the day, there is no tension member. There's no post-tensioning. There's nothing continuous through it. There are a series of stainless steel dowels that pin the stones together. So if it tried to slip, it would actually create a kind of alignment. So there's no tension, but there is a kind of alignment dowel. So there was a compromise between the kind of purist sort of all compression camp and the kind of, we'd like to have belts and suspenders. And so belts and suspenders won. We did embark on a process of producing or procuring the material, the raw material for this. Most stone that you use in architecture is designed and slabbed for countertops, right? It's a certain optimal size. The stones we were talking about were much bigger, so we had to go to the quarry to procure them, which is exciting, looking around a quarry for blocks that sort of meet your parameters, working on these massive blocks and thinking about, can you see the kind of figure of the project in this sort of bigger block, kind of like Michelangelo. But the fabrication process was a huge learning process, looking at the tools, looking at questions of precision. It was very interesting to meet with the fabricators in Milwaukee, Quora Stone, and they said, well, how big do you think the saw is? I said, well, it's about 2 feet diameter. And they said, well, it starts as 2 feet in diameter, but after it cuts the stone, it's a little bit smaller, right? I'm like, I guess. So how do you know where the saw is and where the stone is? I mean, we think our tools are precise. We think that the stone is yielding and the saw is constant. But the saw is also changing because it's also a material, and the stone is wearing the saw as the saw wears the stone. So this idea of like precision and our kind of overinvestment in precision as we think about digital fabrication was kind of a really interesting question. So every time the saw sort of makes a pass, the diameter of the saw changes. And so after a few passes, it needs to be recalibrated before it can sort of go through and continue making those cuts. So kind of, eye-opening questions of fabrication, questions of procurement and quality control. In a certain moment, you would have given your drawings to somebody. They would have produced shop drawings and given them to you, and that introduces a kind of check, right? But if you give them your model and they're fabricating off your model, where's the quality control? How do you know, with certainty, the quality assurance part of this thing? So thinking through questions of quality control with the digital fabrication process also kind of opened some eyes. At some point, we discovered a duck bank under the memorial, which took all the power and data to MIT. And we said, OK, let's not disrupt that. Fortunately, we were spanning over it. There's 32 unique pieces. They come together on the site. We picked a stone that actually has a vein in it, a kind of very delicate, sort of feathery vein. And because it's solid, we wanted people to be able to find it, three-dimensionally. So it's not just a surface condition. It sort of turns the corners. And so if we had picked a single sort of monolithic black, it wouldn't have the same effect as this sort of feathery, white-veined stone. It came together over a winter in Boston that it snowed like 130 inches, so an incredible time to try to build something where you can't set the stone because the stone actually changes dimension when it's cold, and so they were warming the stones before they set them. Think about like the tolerance question of like millimeters of dimension that had to be accounted for in the setting of stone during a kind of blizzard. It came together with the scaffolding. All the scaffolding was on scales, and so a research team from John Oxendorf's group was sort of measuring the weight, the gravity loading. And the interesting thing was as they were lowering the scaffold in the middle, they could see the transfer of weight from the center scales to the ring and then to the perimeter. So you can't see force, but you can measure weight. And so as a kind of research project in real time, they were sort of measuring and watching arching happen, through their instrumentation, which, these guys were so excited, to see the stone not move at all over an 8-hour period when they took the scaffold down. So this is the first time we saw the kind of the void that we had sort of produced through the kind of hollowing out of this vault. So an incredible project, an emotional project, a kind of technologically challenging project, a project we certainly learned a lot on. And I think it does have that effect of sort of creating this sort of uncanny kind of hollowing that you experience on campus if you walk by it. And you might ask, what is this for? Or what used to be here? Or what's this trace that's no longer there? The inside surface is actually polished, and the outside surface is flamed. And so the inside surface actually produces a kind of condensation when it gets really cold. And so the inside might actually drip during certain sort of temperature conditions. So there are surprising effects that were produced through this form, through this process. Another thing I'll say is there's all kinds of sort of desire for meaning from a memorial project. And so even the lighting was something that we sort of thought about and said, well, you know, those 3 lights there, that's Orion's belt. This is a kind of constellation of the stars on the night that Sean Collier was killed. So if you're looking for meaning, we've sort of built in lots of opportunities for it, and not everyone sees it, you know, at first glance. But this idea of like designing forms that have capacity for multiple readings and potentially misreadings, or personal meanings or personal discoveries. This project was completed a few years ago. It was an incredible kind of learning moment. And while we sort of focused on stone and weight, this next project focuses on steel and lightness, in fact, buoyancy. This is something we proposed actually here in the Schuylkill River for what we call it Floatlab, which is a kind of floating classroom. And the idea that, you know, Philly, as you know, a city sort of built on a river, all the kind of commerce that comes with this kind of river frontage, the idea that, you know, 2 rivers are sort of, you know, we're benefiting from 2 rivers. If you follow these rivers, they go right up into coal country, and the kind of history of extraction that brought all this coal out of this sort of area and down the river actually produced conditions like this and conditions like this. And so the Schuylkill River was one of the most polluted rivers in the country. At some point, it actually caught on fire. So this is a story of a river, of a kind of ecosystem, but also the story of a kind of recovery and the idea that the river has been remediated, that it is accessible, and that can we bring people to the river to discover a kind of urban nature in our backyard that we didn't actually know. And so this idea of building a structure that would bring the citizen into contact with a kind of urban nature, change their sort of perception of that nature, and maybe change their behavior towards that nature. How can we sort of work on the kind of human effects, the users that are actually using the river or not using the river? Maybe they're ignoring the river. So bringing the citizen back into contact with the kind of urban nature. It's essentially a submarine. It sort of fills with water, like the ballast chamber is flooded, and it sort of drops it into the river. So to prove this concept, we built a mock-up, which is a good idea. It's a 8 by 8 by 15 foot steel mock-up that we dropped into the, in this case, the Delaware River. We flooded the chamber, sunk it into the river, and produced the kind of effect of being almost at eye level with the river. And this mock-up sort of really tried to sort of capture the effect of being in the water. And we brought our kind of our client and a kind of group of donors to the project, and they sort of experienced this and said, yes, this is something we want to support. This is something we want to invest in. Wouldn't it be great if everybody could sort of walk into the river as easily as that? And so we did get some funding. We're still working on the permitting. It turns out the Schuylkill River requires all kinds of different permits. Like, it's not a building, so you don't get a building permit. It's Parks and Recreations, it's Army Corps of Engineers, it's all kinds of different sort of kind of alphabet soup of different agencies. But there's a lot of goodwill. And so we're working with Bartram's Garden, which is the kind of the user, to sort of create not just the kind of the mooring facility, because we have to anchor it, but also think about the programming. You know, what's going to happen here? What kind of activities? What kind of classrooms? What age groups are going to come? Are they going to do sort of water quality testing? Are they going to look through periscopes and see what's down there? What kind of fish live there? So we're also sort of conceiving of like a series of exercises that would be done by school kids at different age groups to experience the river in a different way. So it's an art piece, it's a submarine, it's a classroom, it's a platform for experiencing the river in a different way. And here's one of the kind of vantage points where you actually look across the river and you see not just the city, but also the kind of the paraphernalia of a kind of extraction industry that sort of grew up around this city. So representing the city to itself in a different way. It's true, I did work at KPF at some point, and working in Asia is so complicated by so many different conditions. So we've done a number of projects in China, and I think I want to talk a little bit about engaging kind of global practice. And you know, this question of the image, you know, like this is the Shanghai, you know, Oriental Pearl. this is Mickey Mouse. You know, the role of the image in architectural production in China can't be sort of overstated. It has to be recognizable, it has to be legible. And so maybe 8 years ago, we completed this project in Chengdu, which was for a client that really wanted to see a building that had a Chinese characteristics. That's what he called it, Chinese feeling. And we struggled with what is Chinese feeling because it seemed to sort of produce a kind of caricature of a kind of culture that we weren't interested in. But we did think hard about what's available in terms of material, what's possible in terms of labor, and we came up with an idea that every brick would be oriented in the same way. And so the bricks are all oriented to the cardinal directions, which meant that some surfaces were true flush and some surfaces were feathered and oblique. And what this meant was that depending on where you were around the building, the bricks would tell you, would orient you, you know. And so a simple idea like that produced a kind of architectural expression like this that maybe this is an oblique surface, and it produced a kind of texture and a kind of vibrancy that the client actually recognized as Chinese, that the laborers could actually set without any sort of complex templates or anything. So we found a kind of sweet spot between a kind of available material and available labor source, a very low-tech solution and a very simple idea. And somehow we succeeded in convincing the client for that, and we're quite happy with it too. I think it turned out in surprising ways, not what we projected into China, but what we sort of co-produced in China, you know, as a kind of discovery. We are also working in this park, which hosted the Shanghai Expo in 2010. You may recall Heatherwick did this sort of seed cathedral. Somebody else did this. They're both articulations of a kind of cultural identity, one being a kind of recognizable kind of pagoda-like structure, the other a subliminal sort of Union Jack, sort of masterfully executed by Heatherwick, the billionaire whisperer. In this context, I like his work, I'm a big fan. In this context, the government in Shanghai is saying we need to build a new park. And that park needs to be engaging to the kind of public, right? Because it's been 50 years since the revolution. China, you know, the people still deserve a park. And so we competed for 2 bridges in this park. And you see some of the pavilions sort of dotting this landscape. This will be a new central park for Shanghai. There was a competition to do these bridges. And we thought, if it has to connect to a kind of Chinese tradition, what are those traditions? And what can we extract from there besides form, right? The thing about Chinese landscapes is that they're not about objects, they're about relationships, they're about views, they're about vistas, there's a kind of playfulness to a Chinese garden. And, you know, we talked about like 1 path versus 1,000 paths, like how do you move through a Chinese landscape? And how do you sort of evoke the kind of figuration? Instead of 2 bridges, we said, how about 1 frame? Like we'll just frame the water with one, we'll build 1 frame, not 2 bridges. And so we pitched this idea of a kind of super bridge, like 2 super bridges that aren't about, you know, A to B, but really about making places, you know, along the way. So we're not just trying to cross the body of water, we're actually finding a way to cross the body of water. So we did present this to the jury as a kind of contemporary expression of a kind of Chinese landscape making tradition. Where the water might actually be the destination. We're not just trying to get across, we're actually trying to find places to be, you know, in the landscape, to have views presented across the water. And so these sort of shapes sort of bring you to the water in different ways. They sort of present vistas across the water. So this was presented maybe a year ago, and we didn't hear anything for like 5 months. And then it turns out that we had actually won the competition, and there was a local LDI that was executing our project without us, which apparently happens all the time. They couldn't get it approved by the government, and so they called us and said, could you help us? You know, we need to get approval. And we said, okay, you know, maybe. So we went back and we looked at their drawings, because they're engineers, they were trying to work it out, and we said, well, it's a very simple idea. You know, we're using, you know, some site cast concrete to create the kind of formwork, and then we're sort of adding kind of textures, you know, this kind of roughness of the material that's creating a kind of resistance or a kind of texture that isn't just all smooth. And that's something important. And maybe the patterning here helps you know like where the areas of stasis and where the circulation is. So there were a few ideas in there. We worked with them to sort of figure it out. We sort of mocked things up to sort of look at the ergonomics of it. But we're delighted to sort of see that they're producing now construction documents on our project in Chinese. And they look a little bit like what we had drawn, actually. So it's not less is more or less like what you've actually presented. So hopefully that'll be under construction this year. That's the happy ending to this one. The last project I want to share is the Uva Memorial, which Linka alluded to, and I think Mabel presented. This is also an incredibly difficult project. This is a project that deals with the kind of archetypal American campus, Thomas Jefferson, designing the academical village. This is a campus that has produced the kind of image of what an American campus should be. It's an ideal, but if you look here, even in the kind of rendering, there is a slave holding a white child, and so this idea of slavery at the university is not, hidden so much. It's actually right under the surface, or right in the kind of margins of this image of this ideal American university. So this is the history of UVA. At the same time, there's a kind of movement to sort of dismantle some of the imagery of these Confederate monuments. This is General Lee's statue in Charlottesville. When we went to our interview, we said, how are these related? This slave memorial, this Confederate statue. And we thought about, like, what's our right response? How do we sort of use new construction to sort of engage with these difficult questions, not obscuring them, but actually sort of bringing them up. So we embarked with Mabel on a process. We interviewed around a process, not around a product. We didn't have a design, we had a kind of process. And we said, we're gonna engage these different groups in Charlottesville. Many of the groups in Charlottesville feel sort of disenfranchised. They feel disconnected from the university. You can imagine the town and gown issues in a town where a lot of the residents are descendants of slaves that built that university to begin with. And so there was a lot of trust questions. After a 5-month process with our fantastic team, we sort of arrived at solutions, proposals that we've tested in different sites with the university, with facilities, with students, with the stakeholders. And we found a kind of consensus. And this idea of like, let freedom ring as a kind of a concept, but also an idea about a ring as a site of gathering, a site of memory, but also of celebration. And so this was the final design that we kind of arrived at. It's a ring right on the main path from the town to the main campus. The ring has an 80-foot diameter. 80 foot is the diameter of the rotunda, which Jefferson designed and which is just behind those trees. So Jefferson's ideal architecture had a kind of spherical figure embedded within the dome. And we like to think about the dome as this kind of interior idealized architectural space and this conical space in the landscape with the same diameter. So it's sort of making reference to that kind of ideal form, presenting a kind of alternative space on campus, on the grounds. The shape of it creates a kind of horizon line, so when you approach it, it's very low and easily accessible. When you enter it, you find yourself sort of below a horizon line, not unlike the Vietnam Memorial by Maya Lin, where you sort of descend into the earth and it blots out the city. In this case, the kind of circle sort of brings you around into a new interior, an interior that's semi-enclosed. We also learned it's within the UNESCO World Heritage boundary, and so it's right, there's the rotunda, there's the memorial. So not only were we sort of working within a very sensitive context, but we also had to get permission from Paris to allow us to work within a Virginia landscape. So I think the only reason they approved it is because it is a landform. It's not an architectural piece, but there's the rotunda, there's the memorial, and they are in a kind of dialogue. And this is made up of 2 cones kind of intersecting on a kind of tilted axis that gives the kind of entry a kind of low edge, and the high point a kind of 8-foot tall edge. And when you enter it, I was there last week, we were punch listing, you really feel enclosed. You feel, in a way, able to be contemplative. You feel, in a way, able to think in a different way than if you were sort of out in the open in the public realm. And so how do we create that space of potentially kind of reflective thinking? The staggering fact that there are up to 4,000 enslaved people working on this university is something that is hard to compute. And the incredible power of the fact that they didn't even have names. They were just recorded as property, you know, and so there's speculation about 4,000 individuals. How do we sort of acknowledge that? Through a memorial, right? And so we don't even know their names. How do we inscribe, you know, something? And so part of the solution was the names that we know, we carve. The names we don't know, we sort of create these underscores as a kind of placeholder, as provisional. As scholarship discovers new names, which, you know, a few weeks ago there was an exciting email that said, we think we found a new name. Can we still get it on the memorial before it's built? So this idea that historians are working in real time, finding content that we could literally carve onto this memorial tomorrow or next week or in a year, I think keeps the memorial as a kind of open-ended project that is not closed and finished and done. This is like the beginning of a process. A few weeks ago, Meijin was there, and it was raining, and all these sort of gashes were starting to, you know, they were either bleeding or crying. It was kind of like a surprise effect that came out of the kind of geometry of the kind of cut and the kind of the marking on the stone. These are things you couldn't really anticipate. They are effects that sort of come out of a kind of material process. The other thing I wanted to say is, like, in terms of fabrication, you know, some of these pieces are solid, like the Collier Memorial. Some of them are panelized. You know, some of these pieces are too big to move, right? If you think about all architecture is made up of pieces, and one of our jobs is to sort of figure out how they fit together and where to put the joints, right? Lucan said, no architecture is monolithic, right? It's your job to figure out how the joints go. So this couldn't be one block of stone. How do you sort of create that joint to give this face its appropriate finish and appearance, and to give the outside face its appropriate finish and material? Thinking about this question of names, thinking about the unknowns, thinking about the gashes on the inside. We want this to be smooth, almost polished. Thinking about the outside, there's a timeline in the bench too, which is a whole other story. Who writes these entries? Who gets to say what history is? We witnessed some incredible debates between historians arguing about what could be said in a public place, because they're cataloging incredible acts of violence. Could this be carved on a piece of stone in the public realm? Those are big questions. The exterior of the memorial is textured. We worked with Eto Eltitigbe, the artist here, and he sort of pulled up some of these images, the kind of the scar tissue. Isabella Gibbon is a freed slave, and this sort of crude sort of carving or gouging of stone. And we combine those images with his practice, which has to do with translating raster images into sort of textures through a process that turns a raster into a toolpath to produce a kind of an image through the kind of carving of the material. This is Isabella Gibbon's eyes. And then through a kind of toolpathing exercise, we were able to sort of turn those gashes into a kind of image. And the image isn't present all the time. It kind of emerges as you walk around it, which is kind of fascinating. And so we sort of worked to turn these toolpaths, which kind of evoke the quarry marks on a piece of stone, you know, the drilling, parallel drilling and breaking of stone, into, and combined with this sort of texture into a kind of scalloped, gouged image. And so when you go there, you will see, you know, hidden in the kind of, in the line work is a kind of image of a kind of eye. And it's funny because sometimes you see it and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have to stand back from it. But there is this kind of subliminal imagery embedded in the material. So similar to the Collier, we used these kind of fabrication techniques and the installation process. These are obviously the panelized pieces, but at a certain point it transitions from panelized to solid, and I'll show you that detail as well. When I went to the site, I was so impressed by this line that flows so perfectly between these two materials coming together, or one material, two pieces, and the way it sort of continues around that corner. I remarked that it's kind of the digital intruding into the real. And it's uncanny because we're not used to seeing the real like that. We're not used to seeing the precision of a compound geometry executed so precisely. And it's a combination of things. It's a digital fabrication process. It's incredible craftsmanship and care, not just in the fabrication, but also in the installation. This is Alex, who's been using these jacks to get these panels exactly in place, using digital surveying techniques to sort of find every corner and locate it in the world. And it produces this incredibly uncanny presence, a material presence in the world. You see the groove and the joint, right? So if our job is to locate those joints, we have to sort of think about what's the largest size we can transport. How do we sort of bring them together with the tolerance that we can achieve? And how do we bring these things together in the world so that they can sort of cohere and produce that sort of surprising horizon line that we've created. There's the eyes, and if you squint, you can start to see there's one eyeball and there's the other eyeball, and then it sort of fades into a series of just score lines. So I invite you to come to Charlottesville and look at it and see if you can see this image. I do think our job is to create sites for memory, for contemplation, for interpretation. So we're not dictating this, but actually we're allowing different readers to sort of read it differently. There was the rendering, and there's the way it looks last week. The other part of this story, as you know, is that Charlottesville became the site of this incredible sort of gathering, Unite the Right. This was a year ago, more than a year ago. And I do wonder, like, why did these people choose Charlottesville as a site for their particular articulation of fear and hate? And I do think, the rotunda is there. They are kind of connecting to a kind of ambivalence on the part of the university, an ambivalence that hasn't been sort of corrected, right? If the university is, well, Thomas Jefferson's our founder. Yeah, he had flaws, but he had slaves. Is that okay? And these guys are saying, yeah, we're like Jefferson. We can be hateful and so I think it's part of this kind of question of writing history and creating unambiguous statements about acknowledging the history, but also taking a position and sort of saying, this is not acceptable. This institution was repugnant back then, it's repugnant now, and we can't paper over it. So what's the role of architecture to sort of make a kind of statement, a kind of declaration of values today in the most powerful means we can? And that sort of brings me to a kind of conclusion. This was a kind of vigil that happened after the Unite the Right rally, I guess 2 summers ago. But it is in the academical village. It's that one sort of iconic shot of Thomas Jefferson's sort of ideal university. And it brings together this question of the space of public, the space, the articulation of a kind of public, the articulation of a kind of set of ideals. I started with this question of forms of engagement, and I do think we tend to think of form and engagement as kind of two different things. I think we can't separate them. We can't think of autonomous form or kind of disengaged or informal engagement. We have to think of these things together. I tried to show different kinds of engagement with technology, engagement with tools, engagement with history. And to say that they're simple forms, obviously they're not just forms, they're processes. We're trying to show that forms emerge through a kind of process, a process of design, a process of engagement, and the necessity of working on those two things together. The second point was about material after media. We are all sort of immersed in this kind of media paradigm where we're kind of bombarded with images and we don't know what's true anymore. And so our job as designers, I think, is to work through that sort of noise, to articulate something clear through that haze, to kind of curate our forms in ways that allow people to sort of gather and connect and sort of confirm certain realities and certain values. So I'm going to end here and just sort of say that we want to think about form as one of our mediums and material through media, but ultimately it's about the kind of engagement, the capacity to sort of build a kind of public and a kind of audience for our work that's so important. Okay, thank you. I'm happily taking questions. I hope that was okay. I didn't mean to like, you know, I realized I didn't even pause, so happy to take questions. Any questions? Or comments?
I have a question, Eric, because Meejin was kind enough to take our students through the Collier Memorial about 2 weeks before it opened.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things, and John Oshendorf gave a talk in Rome last May about it. And so I heard, you know, I heard John Oshendorf's side of the story of the evolution of that. But it seems that there was an incredible intent to actually use something, I don't know if it was jet mist, but an incredible intent to use that stone as opposed to, say, casting it.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly when you're thinking about contemporary materials, it'd just be interesting to hear a little bit more about that decision not to cast something that was so intrinsically, organically formable,
Mm-hmm.
but to choose to carve it from a granite.
Yeah. In that meeting with the contractor, the first thing they said is, we're going to post-tension this thing. You know, we're going to cast it, post-tension it, veneer it. And Meejin's like, what do you mean veneer? I don't know what you're talking about. And then we came back with John Oxendorf and said, it cannot be cast or veneered. It would lose its integrity. We think this needs to be solid. It needs to be interaction of material and mass in space with gravity. And that's what's going to give it its meaning, right? It's not just about a form devoid of material. It's about a form in material having meaning. So it was maybe a week of indecision about how it should be made. And we made our case that it had to be solid. MIT was responsive to that, and they supported us without knowing what it would cost. To make it solid. And I argued, like, if you veneer, you build it out of concrete and you make the stone and you sort of slap it together, it's going to cost more because all these pieces have to come together perfectly. You're going to have to miter all these corners, and it won't look good, it won't feel good, and it won't mean good by doing it that way. So we actually won that argument pretty handedly, thanks to, I think, John Oxendorf's insistence that this is achievable, right? You know, as an architect, you can say lots of things, right? If you have an engineer that backs you up and says, yes, we can do this, we must do this, you know, it's not going to be as meaningful that way, then I think you have a kind of powerful, you know, front to make a persuasive argument. So I think, yes, we want to be persuasive, we want to be articulate, we can be poetic, but you also need to do your homework, and you need to build that argument. You have to come from an informed place. It can't just be a passionate place. And I think we put together our team and we sort of presented it that way. And I think that's how we came out successfully. Yeah. Thank you.
This is the first time I've seen your work, and I think the human interaction is incredibly considerate. And you talk about terms of engaging tools and engaging human interaction. How do you kind of oscillate between engaging digital fabrication and human interaction? And like, what is that negotiation like in your studio?
That's a great question. We don't really put them together like that very often. I mean, we often think about, like, you know, if we did this, maybe people would behave that way, or they would gather this way, or if the swing was this big, maybe 2 people could sit on it. Or, you know, so we think about a kind of human behavior kind of aspect. At the same time, we're thinking, well, how are we going to make that thing? You know, and so the first time we made the swing out of polypropylene sheets, which we cut on a CNC and we welded together. You know, which is effective. You know, 2 cones welded together, but ultimately failed as these swings were kind of banging into each other. So then we said, how else can we make it? Maybe we can rotomold it. And so we researched rotomolding, which implies a kind of 2-part mold and a kind of liquid process where it sort of coats the inside surface. And so we think about both, but not always at the same time. You know, I do think you have to be speculative, and sometimes you want to propose something that no one's ever done before, but you have to have an idea about how you might make it. You know, even with Athens, you know, this idea of sensors, we didn't know how to do that, you know, but we said, we're at MIT, someone knows how to do that, right? We just need to find the right collaborator. And I think being at MIT At that time, there was a kind of fearlessness. I can have this idea. I'm sure somebody can make it happen. We walk into the media lab. They're like, "What color magic carpet would you like?" And I'm like, I'd like an interactive, soundscape. But we did find great collaborators at MIT, and it gave us a kind of attitude that we could present something beyond the limits of our ability to execute today, but certainly within the limits of the possibility of assembling a team that could execute tomorrow. And I think being ambitious that way, I think is important. So if you only do what's been done, you're never going to get that kind of speculative push. So I would encourage everyone to be speculative, do your homework, and then collaborate with people that can help you achieve these things that are just beyond the horizon of what you can do on your own or what you can do today.
That was a great answer.
Hi. Congratulations on a really compelling design at UVA in Charlottesville. Can you talk about the process with the community and the different forms that were in consideration before you landed on the final design?
Yeah. Like I said, when we interviewed, we were deliberate not to have a design. I think you can walk into an interview with a design, and then you could be lucky, you could be dead. So we didn't come in with a design. We came in with a great team that did a lot of work to prepare, and we engaged the committee in a dialogue which was kind of incredible. Some interviews you go through and you're like, I see everyone engaged, and I have a good feeling about this, right? You walk out, you're like, I think we got this. Mabel Wilson was an incredible collaborator. We walked into that meeting and everybody was like, history. And Mabel said, it's about memory, it's about celebration of their lives, not just their pain. And so being able to talk about that with that kind of subjectivity, I think sort of opened up the committee. We also said we're going to design a process, we're not going to design a form. So we said we're going to spend 5 weeks, we're going to go to this high school, we're going to go to this church, we're going to meet with these students, we're going to engage with this faculty member. The university had a group of professors called the President's Council on Slavery and the University. So they've been doing work already. In fact, the students had already had a student competition, an ideas competition. So we met with all these groups that were already engaged. And then we did go to the community many times. To the churches, we went back many times. And so we weren't kind of saying, this is a design. We were saying, what do you think? We did have surveys. We had, kind of sketching. Eventually, we went back and we came up with maybe 10 designs on 6 different sites. And we presented them first to the university because they want to see what you're going to show. And then we took some of those and presented them to the community. It wasn't about choice, it was about getting feedback. And I think to be successful, you have to have buy-in from all the stakeholders, right? So it's not about a democracy, but it's about being open to feedback. Being able to say, this form evokes this. We had some forms that were super fragmented and some forms that were super crisp. And they said, that looks too polished, or that looks too traumatic, and you have to interpret comments from the public who don't know how to articulate what they think, right? But we're trained as designers and critics. We should be trained to listen as well as to persuade, right? So after that process, we narrowed down to a couple of different schemes, and then with the university, we sort of picked the one that was, in a way, there's a question of like, what's the form of the memorial? It's a circle or it's a ring. Why is a ring so pervasive? Because it's a form that people can agree on. Is it a polygon? Is it a tetrahedron? It's a circle. It's a shackle that's broken. It's a horizon line. And so you have to be able to sort of think about it with some agility and think about how other people will interpret it. It's a form of consensus. You have to find a consensus. And for this project, which is so loaded and so potentially combustible, that was a form that people could agree on, the kind of simplicity of it and the kind of experientiality of it. It was not a straight linear process, but I think it turned out pretty good.
So you started your lecture and you mentioned the Meijin's project as this kind of beginning of a set of questions of how we engage architecture. And it had a very clear, tactile, direct effect. And then I guess now the projects have, like 50 layers of engagement, right? Like from the ring all the way to like the constellation, to the texture, to the joint. Do you think that was a kind of intuitive awareness that y'all had from the beginning of what you wanted your practice to be, or is it something that perhaps through engaging projects that kind of require a broader conversation with cities, and because you're dealing with a lot of public spaces, not a residential building or a hospital or something, is it something you had as an intention from the beginning, or was it something that kind of just develops through experience, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think we are all learning how to be designers. We don't come in knowing exactly what we're doing. And over the past, 15 years, we've also figured out a few things. How to be persuasive in a public neighborhood setting. When you're proposing a high-rise building in Boston, there's plenty of people that are kind of not interested in your idea of architecture. They want to know what their views are going to be, how you're going to block their sunlight. And so we're doing a couple of high-rise buildings in Boston, and we've been to these neighborhood meetings like every week you have to present, and every week you get yelled at, by somebody, right? So I think we are learning how to listen, how to be persuasive, how to find ways to come to a consensus. So I would say we're learning how to be architects in the world and find those solutions. I don't know if that gets to your question.
Well, maybe it's something that like just the projects that you've been able to do have pushed for you to open up the gamut of layers to which like people can agree or kind of enjoy the project or accept the proposal.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you a story. When I was at KPF, I worked in a 118-story building in Hong Kong. And that's a big building. Some people want it to be an icon of this or that, right? They see it and they say, oh, this reminds me of this or this reminds me of that. So you have to find a way to design that is open, right? Because if you say it will be this, it's a pagoda, you're dead, right? Because not everybody wants a pagoda. Like KPF had this incredible story, you can ask Jean about it, the tower in Shanghai with a circle in it, right? It seems like it's innocuous, it's a circle, it's a Japanese developer, it's a Japanese flag. Oh my God, you gotta change the design. So this working with symbols can be precarious, right? In a context like Shanghai, where there was a Japanese occupation, right? So it's a true story. There was a circle at the top of this 110-story building. It was changed to a square, because of that misreading of the kind of Japanese thing. So when we were working in Asia, we had to be super sensitive to how it could be read or misread. And the Western architects that work in Asia, they're like, oh, it's a minaret, it's a pagoda, and you have to be super careful with that because there's only one way to read that thing, right? And I think what I learned is like, you have to be agile, you have to be open-ended, you have to give the possibility of different readings. And I find abstraction is a great way to do that, right? So you create something that could be interpreted this way or that way, and you haven't locked in a kind of Chinese cultural identity into a kind of singular image that's sort of locked in time. You call that perpetual presentness. That's what ethnographers do. We don't want to work that way. We want to work in ways that open up the possibility of what could a monument be in the future? What could be Chinese identity in the future? So a lesson I learned from KPF, think about your audience. Think about how it's going to be read or misread. And I think that still sticks with me. Simon.
Oh, yeah, I do. Thanks, Pedro. Eric, I thought it was a brilliant presentation, and I know that you're quite sensitive to, I would say, details. And today I was talking to my students about Alto, right? The leather straps on the handrails for the Wolfsburg Library. I do believe you're at this level now. The control and precision of all the material effects, whether it is honed rock finish so that it condensates when it's cold, that's not a kind of facile gimme. You probably worked hard on that. Where in the office are you producing kind of mock-ups for these effects to make themselves manifest so you can work with them as you're saying, these forms of engagement?
Yeah. I would like to believe your theory that we know all these things and we're in control.
But it's not a mistake. I mean, especially on the UVA monument, I mean, the fact that, you decided that there's going to be the lines on one side to make the face, and on the other it's going to be smooth, and then also bleed out when it starts raining. I can't believe that's a kind of a causality of just, trying things, yeah.
You know, I have to say some of these things were accidents, honestly, happy accidents. You know, we try to prototype things. You do a lot of prototypes, you do a lot of mock-ups, but you cannot anticipate all these effects, you know. So I would say definitely prototype, you know, one-to-one scale, real materials if you can. You know, we have great collaborators that run robots that carve stone for us. We have collaborators that make, you know, fantastically complex wood, steel. I think the takeaway is like you need to know as much as you can before you build it. You know, last weekend we were like using these big polystyrene things to mock something up, but we don't know all these things, so we are also kind of open. You have to be open to discovering. I guess that's another takeaway.
So I guess you're also writing in the fact that in their contracts you want to have full-scale mock-ups. Is that something you're also working through?
Yeah, you try to write that into your contracts. Hopefully it doesn't get cut out. Right. Yeah. No, architecture's hard. I think you have to sort of be willing to sort of struggle through it and make some discoveries and be open to learn about it. You know, maybe you find something amazing in the stone or in the wood. Okay. Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you.
I was really interested in seeing that you started with Vito Acconci because, and I'd never made this connection with your work, with some of his artwork, which was always bridging into architecture. And it was, a few years ago, I had the pleasure of interviewing him for a long time for a symposium here that was going on with History of Art. And, you know, there's so much similarities in the use of vantage lines, of geometry, of relationality, even of sinking things into water. But, you know, in this kind of question of is it architecture, is it art, he pronounced that no, he was definitely not an artist anymore, he was an architect.
Oh.
Right. And it was very interesting because I think I came to the opposite conclusion because the level of resolution was not that of an architect. And so I'm sure you've thought of this before, but I was hoping you might address that because I see this work and it's definitely architecture.
Yes.
And a lot of that I think is in the kind of thoroughness and the multivalency you bring in the systems of material and of resolution. Could you discuss that a little bit without getting too tedious into art versus architecture?
It's a great question. I mean, sometimes we pursue work as architects, sometimes we pursue work as artists. And sometimes it's strategic to be an artist because an artist can get away with a lot more than an architect, right? What does the artist want, you know? So sometimes Mijin is presented as the artist of Howler Yoon, and that's strategic. I do think how the work is framed is where it lands. I also worked at Diller Scofidio, which also flirts with this idea of art or architecture. We're always sort of flickering between the two. Ultimately, I would say they're architects. We're architects, not because we were trained that way, but because that's the discursive framework in which we operate, you know. When I was in school, a friend of mine was an artist, and he would make models, and they were so ugly. And I was like, why did you put it together this way? And he's like, well, that's your disciplinary issue, you know, how things come together. Like, I don't care. For me, the idea resides elsewhere. But I realized that architects, we have a kind of way to work. We have a kind of discourse around how things come together. And the ideas we're trying to convey are conveyed through the way that they're executed, right? So I would say that we're definitely architects. We're not fashion designers. We're not electrical engineers, though we work with engineers. We create wearable architecture. But I would say it's all architecture because it's ultimately concerned with space. It's ultimately concerned with personal space and interactivity, which are fundamentally, I would say, architectural issues, not concerns of fashion or furniture or other discourses. So I'm emphatically in the architecture camp, precisely because that's the way we think about it and that we talk about it, and the discourse that we inhabit, not just the material or the form that it happens to take.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much.